Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Tina, Rebecca, and Leah, and Noel, and welcome to our fourth panel, who we'll invite now to turn on their cameras. In some way, I think this session may have a lot of crossover appeal for both trade professionals and the general public. How does what happens around the world impact trade? How does it impact us all as consumers and users of products that move around the world on boats, planes, trucks, and through cyberspace? And what can and should companies do to manage those risks? We have a great panel assembled, starting with our moderator, my dear friend Penny Naas, TradeExperettes. Penny worked with us to pull together this all-star panel, and we're delighted to welcome here today Stefanie Ali, Senior Director at Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel; Marc Gilbert, a Managing Director and Senior Partner at Boston Consulting Group; Michelle Plante, Director, Risk Management, Resiliency, and Enterprise Risk and Security Management at TE Connectivity; and Cheryl Steele, Vice President of Global Security and Resilience and the Chief Security Officer at Starbucks Coffee Company, which I think a few of you may have heard of. Welcome to all of you. Penny, take us away.
Well, great, Ken. Thank you so much. And I agree with Jeremy's last point, the world is complicated. So today, and I think we're going to have a fantastic session. First, I think we're going to look to identify the top areas of geopolitical risk to supply chains and trade. And then we're going to turn to discussing concrete steps companies and governments can take to identify and plan for these risks. And finally, how to help companies think about turning these risks into opportunities. Now, frankly, after last evening, I think even Taylor Swift would want to make an appearance to hear about all of the great things we're going to talk about today, although she, I think, had quite a late night, so won't be able to probably join us, Ken, in case you may have sent her the link. But with that, I'm going to turn first to Marc Gilbert from BCG. Marc, I think that you all have recently completed some analysis on these issues. Can you share with us what some of your thoughts are with regards to the kind of the top geopolitical risk and how they might impact supply chains, and then what companies can do to potentially think about mitigating those risks?
Fabulous. Thank you, Penny. Appreciate you all accepting me here and having me on this panel. It is a pleasure and an honor. In response to your ask, Penny, I think, well, typical of us consultants, it would be useful, or I'd be remiss to not bring up a couple of PowerPoint displays. So I'll do so, and please bear in mind this is a body of work that has been evolving, that BCG has been working on for several years now. So let me share my display. And do you all see this? Is that a yes? We're good? Excellent. I'll put it into presentation mode. Very good. So BCG set up this entity to evaluate, observe, and advise clients around geopolitics and trade 6 years ago. And something that we've been doing is trying to figure out what the evolution of trade will look like over the course of time. And this is our fourth edition. And of course, events of the year, whether it's COVID, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East, influence a bit of our outlook. But this is a bit of a build slide, and please keep in mind this is only the flow of goods. So it's not the flow of services, it's not foreign direct investment, but it's purely the flow of goods. And we take existing data and we forecast it out. There's a set of algorithms behind this. It's 500,000 data points. It's not perfect. In fact, it is absolutely specifically wrong, but it is directionally, we believe, correct. And a couple of messages will pop out here. Let me fill the slide up and you'll see it as it appeared. So the first message is trade is growing at 2.8%, which is below a global GDP growth over the next decade. So it's going to continue to grow, albeit at a slightly slower rate than GDP is growing, at least the consensus forecast. What that means is this is a different world than we've been accustomed to for the last 40 years, where trade has grown faster than global GDP. Whereas now we're seeing it's not a lot, it's about 0.2%, 0.3% off consensus, but it is slightly slower growth. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is, not surprisingly, there's more green with the Southern Hemisphere. And green is essentially I'm growing faster than GDP. Yellow is I'm growing, but slightly slower than global GDP. And red is I'm shrinking. So you see more green in the south-south, if you like. And historically, it's been much more north, east, west. Now it's north-south and it's south-south. You do see some red, of course, between China and the US, the UK after Brexit. It's not a pretty picture. The dislocation that's taken place between Russia and Europe, and a couple of other small reds. And then you see some yellows where it's slower, but it's still continuing to grow. So think of US with Canada, and think of EU with China, for example. What are the main drivers that you get that really explain this chart is really quite important to us. And there are essentially 5 of them. And the display prior to that said it, but it said it in a way that might have been hard to digest. So the first one is there's really an increase that's expected in the amount of trade between what we call USMCA bloc. It's been reinforced with efforts like the CHIPS Act and the IRA. Frankly, the most benefiting nation, and we all know Mexico has now surpassed China as the main trading nation with the US. It's mostly Mexico. Yes, as a Canadian, Canada does benefit as well, but not nearly as much as Mexico. And we call this force number 1, stronghold North America. It's the most material change that we'll see over the next decade. The second force, which has been underway for many years now, has not changed, whether it's the prior administration or the current. It's the China trade dynamic, which is most acute with the US, but actually is systemically affecting China and all Western nations. Western, as we think of the G7 and so forth. We saw that Europe didn't sign the trade agreement with China. So the trade dynamic with China is evolving in that there's a desire, an actual action to reduce concentration in China. Now, where that trade is going, in part, it's coming home, stronghold North America in our case, but in part, it's also going to Southeast Asia. Think of the force driver number 3, which is ASEAN trade growth. And there already has been lots of moves. Think of Apple that's going into Southeast Asia to assemble iPhones, but it's also going to India, which takes us to the fourth main consideration or driving force here, which is the rise of India. India has put a substantial amount of energy and effort to rebuild its infrastructure, build up its logistics network, reduce corruption. And we believe India is going to be a net benefactor of the shift of trade, predominantly out of China, but also moving beyond offering services to offering finished goods. Again, Apple going there as an example of the trust that they have in the capabilities of India to furnish and supply an appropriate quality product. And then the last one is mostly behind us. It's happened. It's in arrears. It's the divergence out of Russia. Truth be told, trade hasn't stopped out of Russia. It's just gone elsewhere. It's just one of these forces that's major and dislocating and affecting all parts of the world, but it's kind of one of those that has happened. So I'm trying to go fast to give a chance to others to chime in. I'll just close with 5 main actions that we see companies, clients of ours, take as no regret moves. Clearly, the word resiliency stands out, but it really comes through geographic diversity, reducing concentration risk. It makes for more complicated supply chains. So one would think more resilient, yes, but slightly more complicated because you have more procurement, more manufacturing points. The second one is it brings in volatility and pricing, and it can expose you to inflation. So you need to navigate that very well. I think inflation's finally subsiding, so this is less of an issue, but certainly the volatility continues to be an issue that firms are dealing with. The third piece is, we call it fragmented world organizations. So what you set up in Southeast Asia or in China is different than what you set up in the Western world. Large corporates weren't set up this way. They're clearly moving this way now to segregate data, to protect intellectual property, and actually just to be able to source and serve a market with unique characteristics in a fragmented world. The next piece is making sure you're managing risk and cybersecurity actively. and not waiting for it to happen to you. And the last one, and the one that's most dear to me, is this notion that geopolitics affects you only on the margin and that you only deal with it when there's a shock is behind us. It's part of the boardroom. It's part of the C-suite. It's now part of the capital allocation process and strategic planning process in most large corporates, certainly those that have multiple sources or multiple destinations in their products or services. And that's really moved from a sort of GR tendency or sitting in comms to actually sitting front and center in the planning processes. All right, Penny, I tried to do it as quickly as I could. It's a lot of content, hard not to do with in less time.
No, thank you, Marc. Thanks very much for that. We'll come back to you on a couple of some of the more specific points in a bit. I want to turn to our other panel of experts. So Cheryl, sitting at Starbucks, a company I think many of us know well on this call, probably consumed some of your products today. Reacting to Marc's presentation, does this fit with what you're seeing, or are there things that maybe are slightly different than or expand upon what Marc has said?
Thanks, Penny. I think Marc set me up perfectly with his final slide, because there are two takeaways on that particularly that I think are my lived existence every day, and that was this element of kind of turbocharging around risk preparedness, and then that second piece around building geopolitical muscle. For some folks in the audience, you might be wondering why somebody whose kind of subheader title is Chief Physical Security Officer is on a panel like this, but it really comes from my working title, which is around resiliency. And so, a big piece of what my team is doing and kind of my role as I look at it is much more of that of a risk professional. So how do we help integrate insights such as those from BCG, from others, from across our global enterprise into actionable insights for the C-suite? As you mentioned, Starbucks, thankfully, is a part of many people's daily routine, but of course, not just here in the United States, but across the 84 countries in which we operate more than 34,000 stores. That is part of who we are. It is operating as a global company selling largely coffee, which is a commodity coming out of origin countries. And so these elements of how do we be forward-looking, interpret insights through the lens of the enterprise, and kind of digest those in a way that are meaningful to the business, right? So it's one thing to talk about a potential for geopolitical conflict. What does that mean for the world? But then what does it mean to our C-suite, to our board, and to our shareholders as they're thinking about the future of Starbucks? So those are just kind of two of the things that immediately resonated for me coming out of Marc's presentation and on this topic writ large. Thank you, Cheryl.
Michelle, moving maybe from the physical, the coffee and the shops, to the electronics and the service-based. How is TA Connectivity thinking about these issues as well? Does Marc's presentation summarize what you're thinking about internally?
Yeah, thanks, Penny. That's right. So TE Connectivity is, I like to say, the biggest company you've never heard of. We manufacture small, high-tech components. And so we are everywhere, share a similar footprint as Cheryl was saying, a global company, indeed. And I think what resonated for me, at least, and for my team, is this notion, I really like that geopolitical muscle building. One of the ways that we're seeking to enhance decision support is adding an intel component to the analyses. So we talked about kind of building that muscle, but it can be harnessed internally as well. And you've heard me talk about the existing intellectual horsepower that may exist within your companies, your organizations. Who's gathering that, and who's putting something together to arrive or help executives arrive at a so what for their company or their business unit or their region. And as Cheryl points out, yes, you can be everywhere, everyone's reading the news, but what is the impact to the business? What do people actually care about? And I think that's part of that geopolitical muscle building that Marc alluded to and that Cheryl hit on as well. Thanks, Penny. I'm happy to go on, but I'm sure we all have a lot of thoughts here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that, geopolitics is not something that in the past has been incorporated in most MBA programs. So we have a lot of senior executives that are also having to learn on the job on some of this stuff. Stefanie, maybe you can talk a little bit. How does, Rice Hadley Gates work with your customers and your clients to help them and help boards and the C-suites with that, given, Connie Rice, Steve Hadley, Bob Gates, and kind of the expertise they can bring to folks and that they do bring to bear to, do you see the same things, some of the same stuff that we heard from Marc?
Thanks, Penny, for having me here. I really appreciate it. And yes, a lot of what Marc and Cheryl and Michelle is saying really resonates. And I think the thing that we see that's interesting is there is absolutely the desire to build that geopolitical muscle and turbocharge. I like how you said that, Cheryl, the risk preparedness. The challenge is sometimes that shift and getting the right process, getting the right resources in place, that can be a little tricky. There was a McKinsey survey in December that asked executives what their number one worry is. It's geopolitical risks. But in that same survey, interestingly, when the executives were asked what their top priorities were for 2024, they said the priorities were, where geopolitical risks were at the bottom. And they were, of course, focused on things like growing their company, AI, the day-to-day kinds of things they have to do to run their business successfully. So this is where we come in, because we help them step back, we help them zoom out, and we help them figure out a process that's going to help them track these risks, and not just track them and monitor them, but actually put in place some mitigation strategies, or even take advantage sometimes when risks pop up. So what we do is actually a process that the CIA does, which is we set up a risk matrix with clients. And so it really depends on the sector. It really depends on the customers that client is selling to. But the idea is you break down risks into very discrete, measurable categories that you can watch. And so I'm talking about things like, if you're talking about political risks, you look at frequency of meetings between leaders. You look at the kind of economic actions that are going on, positive and negative. And you basically assess, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Or is it kind of at a steady state? And you do that across many, many dozens of different indicators in that matrix so that you can get a more holistic picture of what's happening in that market or in that series of countries you're worried about. And then what we recommend that the client does is, and when they've done that internally, by the way, they get input from a variety of different sources, from their own people on the ground in country, from open source, from other channels. And then we also will meet with them and we'll go through what they've ranked everything as, and we'll give them our feedback. Because sometimes what happens is you have people who are absolute experts. They're on the ground, they're in Hong Kong or wherever, but they have understandable equities. If they're on a sales team, their worries about risks might be a little different than ours are, because we know the political climate in DC, or we've had some very high level of conversations with officials, and we kind of know where the policy is going. And so we have some different worries that we want to make sure the company is taking into consideration. So the idea is you make the matrix, you classify everything, and then you really rigorously test the assumptions and you challenge them if necessary. And then the other important piece is you don't just do that when a crisis erupts, and you don't just do it once a year. You have to set up a mechanism where you're actually doing this as part of your normal business. So sometimes it's once a quarter, sometimes it's twice a year. It really depends on what the situation is. But the idea is it's mandatory and it has to be done. And it's just part of business. And then the other piece, the final piece of all this, is that as you develop that matrix, you start thinking, okay, so what would be something that would happen that would be catastrophic, or that would cause us to really need to change something about our operations, something about how we protect our employees, something about the way we do business, supply chains, whatever it is, data. And at what point would we need to take action? And what should those action or actions be? So you develop those strategies before you need them, ideally. And then when your risk indicators get to a point where it's blinking yellow and you start to have concerns, you can go ahead and go to leadership and start having those conversations early. So that's the process that we recommend, and we have found to be very helpful for clients.
Thank you, Stefanie. Michelle, can I ask, to follow up on that a little bit? So when you talk about some of the information, let's get very practical here. Inside a company, sometimes you have executives and they might read wherever the headquarters is, local sports paper, to see what the local sports scores were, and maybe the Wall Street Journal. How do you take what Stefanie's talking about and bring it into your company and bring in the right information sources so that everybody's on the same page in today's world? I know that's a challenge, but everybody's on the same page with regards to kind of some of the main facts as you guys are working through and thinking about your risk and resiliency planning.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it goes to, excuse me, that notion I mentioned earlier of kind of harnessing what's out there, both internally and externally, like you said, from the paper or from your government affairs team or from your legal ops or someone on the ground. And that's why, at least what we've sought to do within TE is build this kind of one voice, if you will, right? So that because something could happen and boom goes in the middle of the night in XYZ region, but the executives, the decision makers aren't sure how that applies to them. But by doing that kind of sourcing, figuring out, does this really have an impact? Harnessing, like I said, the internal inputs, the external, and filtering. I know everyone's heard it, the signal through the noise, and then kind of that concise, so what? This is how it could play out, or this is why we think you need to pay attention to this one piece, this one nugget, and try to give them a more concrete impact. And that goes to, like as you're mentioning, the resiliency piece. So how do we test for that impact? Stefanie mentioned this too, that robust kind of testing, the rigor around tabletop, scenario playing, what have you. But all the better if you can hinge it or peg it to something real life. And, another company's tragedy could be your company's learning opportunity. And I hate to couch it like that, but I think there's value in that exercise. There's certainly value in benchmarking, networking with peers, even the peers who have been a victim of the whatever XYZ catastrophe went down. Comes down to conferences like this, networking, your peers, knowing who your stakeholders are on the outside, even if they look like competitors side by side. But it's all about, and you've heard me say this before, Penny, relationships, rapport, communication. But that's where we see it play out.
Great. Cheryl, maybe to build on that. So as you think about, and we had a previous conversation talking about how do you make sure that you're not Chicken Little? So particularly if what you're talking about may be increasing cost in the organization, a question we got coming in on the Q&A. How do you think about when you take these things and how you take these things to the C-suite to help them with making decisions and understanding what's really important and why it's worth maybe the extra cost?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Penny. I think part of it is trying to socialize early and often a construct around noise to incident to crisis, and sort of helping to share and solicit feedback as well of like, hey, these are general constructs which for our risk sensing organism, we're going to think about this as noise, and they're going to be the types of things that we filter out. These are going to be the types of things that kind of cross that threshold. And what we've tried to do through that is at least create a framework for conversation where we can kind of bring this a common set of language across every business unit, across every geography, and up to the top level of the enterprise to at least get people talking the same type of language, and then sort of have that default of, and if you think you're in a moment of crisis, reach out to this team because we are your crisis management team. We can help you assess, we can help you navigate. I think another piece of this is really kind of understanding like what are the highest tier principles or concepts or issue sets that your C-suite is concerned by. I think for a company such as Starbucks, things that are always going to be top of mind are, number one, the physical safety and security of our partners and customers around the world. The second is going to be the reputation, that the brand reputation that is represented in the siren. And so kind of the rule of thumb, and this is, it evolves as you develop relationships with your C-suite. The rule of thumb that I've kind of evolved is I will err on the side of early if incomplete information. And I will apologize up front that sometimes I may get it wrong, meaning, perhaps I have informed you of something that is below what you want on your radar. Perhaps there'll be something that I have deemed more in the noise category. And let's just set up that parameter at the beginning, that the intention is here and that there's an openness for an ongoing feedback loop. I think another piece about this, and it's really going back to what Stefanie was saying in her remarks, we anchor around the enterprise risk management framework. What are the top level enterprise risks that have been identified by our general counsel, by our CFO, and for which we brief the audit and compliance committee of the board? That's kind of set and established. And I think for my function in partnership with others, such as government affairs, our communications teams, our regional leadership teams, is to then understand where are the intersectionalities, right? Rarely does a risk materialize in the world solely in the silo of a risk owner, right? If there is an issue with the global supply chain, getting a product from point A to point B, one could say, oh, well, that is a supply chain risk, but it's going to show up in perhaps the experience that a customer has if their favorite beverage isn't available, or their favorite food product. And so I think, having functions such as Michelle and I sit in, we're sort of the neutral brokers, right? We don't have a specific equity in the issue. Our equity is the enterprises. And that often allows us to work cross-functionally to kind of ask provocative and curious questions to help solution and get in front of what could materialize.
Thank you, Cheryl. Marc, can I turn back to you? So you've heard what Cheryl, Michelle, and Stefanie had to say. One thing that we haven't really touched on, I think, is like, what is the role of governments and industry associations? We've got a lot of embassies, foreign governments on here as well. As we think about some of this, what is the right moment, and how should we be thinking about that? I go back to the book Chips Wars, where the U.S. government got caught off guard by the semiconductor issues because they weren't aware of where things were in the industry itself. So kind of, where is government's responsibility on this? Where are companies' responsibilities to kind of have that dialogue? And maybe, Michelle, we can come back to you. I know you have a point on relationships as well that you want to talk through as well. But Marc, maybe to get your instant reactions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll take a stab at that, and please others chime in. Role of government and industry associations is where I'll go first. Really see two main things. One is around information transparency. It's not good when the companies and the firms are caught off guard. To the extent that something can be shared, it should be shared so that the enterprises know what's coming and what's emerging, so they don't make flawed capital allocations decisions, and that they clearly understand the direction of travel. Of course, there's an onus on the said corporate to be plugged in if the transparency is being offered, but they're not taking it. That's a deficiency on part of the corporate. And the second piece is around education, particularly the industry association plays a role, in our experience, to help making sure that it's not just the large players that have the resources and the wherewithal, but the small and medium-sized players also have access to the education. And often enough, the bigger guys tend to have scale and self-educate, but the association really plays a big role in educating, bringing along everyone in the industry so that they understand either where it's going, direction of travel, or how they should prepare and brace themselves. We've heard a lot of good examples here in terms of what folks are doing. I think the association of any industry should be using exactly these types of dialogues to help educate competitors and peers. So those are two main things that I see association and government hopefully role in this dynamic.
Great, thanks on that. Michelle, I don't know if you want to build on any of the relationship points.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't want to take time away. I feel like we're saying the same thing, which is, I like how Cheryl put it, early and often. I think that goes to the rapport and the credibility building, but it takes time, right? So hopefully, that the ideal is that you've got a company or a team that supports that investment in creating those relationships and cultivating them. But I know I don't want to get off. There was another panel or another question that came in that I think is a bit more meaty for one of you guys or one of us to take. Thanks, Penny. Yeah. I want to.
So I know there's a question that's come in on shipping, and Cheryl, I think we're going to talk about it. I think we've also got some folks on the call. This is a question asking a little bit about some of the future risk. What are some of the things that people should be having on their radar screen that are emergent risk or things that folks are looking at? Stefanie, I'll turn to you on that after Cheryl. But Cheryl, I think I don't know if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, no, when I saw that question come through, I think that the thing that immediately came to my mind that we just haven't verbalized yet is climate change and climate impacts. You know, we're talking a lot about the geopolitical tensions, but I think also top of mind as we look ahead, you know, not just in the current year. I mean, you know, we've got all the issues that are happening in the Red Sea and the complications with the Houthis' actions there, which is affecting shipping lines going through the Suez Canal. But as we look ahead, the projections in terms of water flow through the Panama Canal are also kind of creating concerns. And when then you kind of think about those challenges and impacts on shipping, cost factors, environmental impacts of other ways of shipping product at scale, it becomes a really kind of complex juggernaut that I think is going to be, again, it won't know any national or industry boundaries to think about how that kind of impacts us as we look, you know, not just in the near out years, but 5, 10, 15 years out.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've heard from some folks is that where we have infrastructure built today may not be where we need the infrastructure in the future, because climate change may change not only our ability to enter certain ports or to go through things like the Panama Canal, but also that goods will be grown and produced in different places because the climate's going to change that. And that's something that probably is a future risk with regards to the actual infrastructure around trade that we might need to think through. Stefanie, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of the emerging risks that you all are looking at and that you have an eye on.
Yes, I would just underscore something that Cheryl just mentioned about the Houthis and the Red Sea, because, you know, this situation from our perspective, it doesn't seem like, unfortunately, it's going to get resolved soon. And in fact, even if the situation in Gaza, if there's hopefully some kind of an end to that at some point, then it's now that the Houthis have seen that they can cause this kind of serious disruption at a pretty low cost to themselves, they may well do it again, you know, for reasons that they decide to embark on that course. So that's something that we're worried about too. I think there's also more and more discussion also about potential attacks on Iran, whether by US or by Israel, and vice versa, also potential Iran unleashing their proxies more. So those things also could amp up concerns that we have if those happen.
Great. And Michelle, I know, did you want to chime in on the climate change point?
Well, I'm really glad that Cheryl brought it up. And I think there's other angles here for everyone in the room to consider. I know climate change can be a security risk too. And it goes back to the resiliency. And I don't want to get too off topic, but if you've got a region where we know water shortage is coming, or we know they're facing a drought, for example, you know, will criminal organizations divert that water? Will the government ensure that businesses are protected over townspeople or residences? So I think there's a lot of different ways to approach climate change, and I struggle, just full transparency, to get that hook. You know, what's the one, because it is kind of amorphous at the moment, and I don't think companies are seeing that bottom line impact just yet. But again, it goes back to what I was saying about that intel and trying to spot trends around the corner. Thanks.
Thank you. Marc, I know that you have to drop a few minutes before the end of our panel. I was going to turn it over to you for a second. Also, we've talked about climate, but I think inside every company at the moment, all everybody's talking about is AI and how AI can be used as a productivity tool, how it can be used for all kinds of things. And before you go, maybe just to grab you for a little bit to talk a little bit about technology and digitalization, and you know, in the next 10 years, you know, is that something that's an opportunity? Is that something that's a risk? Is that something that it just depends in terms of where it may take us in supply chains?
Thank you, Penny. Let me put it this way: the geopolitics of technology are real, and businesses are dealing with it and addressing it as we speak here today. They play out in the following way. Let's just look at AI. There's clearly a race for being at the front. So China's got their efforts underway. The US does, and believe me, the EU does as well. Then there's the regulations, and that's where the geopolitics play out. China has regulated, and I can get access to all of the data. That's the regulation. The EU has regulated in favor of the consumer. The US, for now, has exercised an executive order but hasn't yet regulated, and I say yet because maybe they will, maybe they won't. But as a firm, and as it's adopting AI, sample technology, I need to decide if I'm going to only serve one market and deal with that regulation, or have one that serves them all and is biased to one regulation, or live in a heterogeneous world and have a certain offering or application in Europe that's different from China, that's different from the US. And you know, Apple has moved to a very benign example, has moved to a simple USB-C charger. Why? Because Europe passed a law. And it's not the Americans. I'm happy with my charger, but now I've got to change all my charging codes as soon as I get a new phone, and the whole family's like using different cords. It's the EU that drove it, and Apple said, that's fine. We'll make it ubiquitous for all. Sorry, consumers from non-European Union, but you're going to adopt the European Union way. I'm using that as a sample of a firm that decides to follow one regulation that serves all, or may decide that, you know what, I'm going to have a different way in China because of IP and data protection from the US, from EU. So be aware, geopolitics of technology are in play. They've been in play. Firms have adjusted to it and will continue to do so. And it's always a question of heterogeneous versus homogeneous based on where the regulations are going. Our clients are dealing with that day in, day out, and we've seen it play out. Thank you.
And Marc, can I ask you just one quick question? And maybe Stefanie, you've got examples too. You know, when you have a client that is having to grapple with maybe making a significant change like that, you know, when you work with the C-suite and the boards, what motivates them to like take that geopolitical risk seriously and actually invest the monies? Is it that, you know, your competition's going to do it and you're going to lose out? Is it,
well, the great question. The worst instance, which does happen, unfortunately, too often, is when they've been stung. So, you know, we all saw the military vehicles moving towards the border well in advance. Some of our clients moved, some didn't. Some stockpiled titanium, some didn't. Some took 6 months to recover from a titanium shortage, some didn't. It's unfortunate that some firms are still waiting to be, unfortunately, stung or hurt, and then they clearly are ready to act. And it's almost punitive because they've been hurt so badly, they've been in prison, so now they're willing to get the shackles off. Those that are open to it, it's typically through either collateral observations, peer discussion, competitive conversations. And honestly, it's not through us. It's people talking to each other. I think Michelle raised this already. Call it peer-to-peer, peer-to-competition. And those are the best instances and the best vehicles to sort of wake up and overcome that resistance. The easiest way to overcome resistance is, oh boy, I'm in trouble. I've been hit. I got to act. That's not a great place to be. We like to bring people together to overcome that resistance, not through listening to us as a third party, but to listening to each other. And that is the most powerful vehicle in a good situation in terms of overcoming resistance.
Thanks, Marc. And just we got 8 more minutes. So if you have a question, you haven't put it in the chat, please go ahead. And I know, Marc, you may have to drop on us in the next minute or two. Stefanie, your thoughts on, you know, how do you see, we have had a question in the chat about how to bring these issues and make them get movement on them internally. So have you seen any instances or anything beyond what Marc has addressed in terms of how to help companies with some of those really tough decisions that they have to make, particularly when the world is gray, not black and white?
Yes, I think what Marc is saying about providing examples is really helpful. I think that helps them think about possible outcomes. The other thing we try to do is we try to really map out not just the initial impact, but what's a second order, a third order, a long-term kind of impact based on certain decisions they may make or may not make. And we help them think that through, because sometimes the first order impact they think they can live with, or they think they can figure out a better solution, you know, but we help them think through other potential ramifications, which sometimes helps clarify.
Yeah, totally agree. Cheryl, can you Cheryl or Michelle or Stefanie, can you talk a little bit about, you know, there's risk, which is a very, I want to say, a defensive posture that when you're thinking about risk, you're reacting to something. How do you use your planning to seek out and put opportunities in front of your senior executives and or the government or others? How do you position that? And is that something you also actively look at and pursue as you think through your risk and resiliency and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first cut at that. I mean, I think to your point, we often think of risk as something to be avoided as opposed to something to be leveraged. And so I think that a very critical opportunity is, working for a company that is very growth focused. It is all about what are new markets or what does new growth look like. And so then it just kind of becomes an opportunity to have really thoughtful conversations at the front end about what's the risk appetite, what's the risk appetite on maybe a couple of different metrics, to then sort of say, well, what strategy might we want to lean into? And that was kind of what was also coming to my mind around that question of how do you also convince the company to sometimes make an investment around a risk? It's because there might be a pretty good upside in doing so. So I think the more that we, again, as risk professionals can be at the table at the early stages around business strategy of understanding the respective equities that might be in play, and then looking for, again, that kind of intersectionality that turns risk from something to run away from to something that we can lean into with whatever the guardrails are of our C-suite and our board. I think that's a very fun part of the conversation, because nobody wants to be in the defensive reactive of, oh, what is everyone else doing, and am I with the pack, lagging the pack, or leading the pack? I think it's more of how do we kind of use our skills and insights as risk sensing functions multidimensionally to advocate and advance the business.
Thanks, Cheryl. I want to just reference, we've had two questions come in, one on Africa, one on India. And I know that the Africa question will be addressed in the next panel. We have Floria Lazier on the next panel, who I know is an absolute expert on those issues and will be happy to address that question. And on the India point, similarly, I think that'll be an area that will be addressed in the next panel. So thank you for those questions. Michelle, Stefanie, any, final, maybe as we're coming up on the last 4 minutes, any final thoughts about how you guys take, and think about risk moving into the opportunity lane? Michelle, I'll call on you first.
Thanks, Penny. I'm smiling a little bit because Cheryl took the words, the risk appetite and the guardrails, and even included fun. And she's absolutely right. I mean, that is the fun. And I find our team spends actually more time gauging those risk appetites. It's not a gotcha, but it is nice to go back and say, well, earlier you said that you were comfortable right up until here. We're approaching that area, right? Are you still? And then retesting those appetites, retesting the guardrails, but going back to that original conversation, which I agree with you, Cheryl, is fun. Thanks, Penny. Thanks.
Thank you. Stefanie.
Yes, and I agree with all that. And I would just give one concrete example that we get asked a lot about, which is Saudi Arabia, which I think many people associate it with some negative stereotypes. And there's also considerable risk there, of course. But the interesting thing is that there's been a lot of reform in the last few years and a lot of new sectors opening up. FDI has increased almost by 300% since 2019. And now, because of some new regulations, the Saudis have, put in place, over 200 international companies have opened regional HQs there in Saudi. So my point is that you see there's a lot of movement there. And so for some companies who have a certain profile, it can be a place where there's a lot of opportunities despite some risk. And also, even despite what's happening in parts of the Middle East right now, Saudi has been mostly insulated from that. And we expect that it may continue to be. So that's a great example where you say Middle East and you think, oh, geez, the Middle East is on fire. Why would you want to do much there? Let's pull back. And Saudi might be a place, or UAE, where maybe you don't have to right now, depending on your company. So.
Thank you for that. So maybe just as a final question, I mean, one thing that I think we hear a lot of people say in the risk world, this is for final thoughts, we talk about controlling what you can control. And that I think is something that, governments as well as corporations really think about. But when do you need to think about the other issues that are out there, and the fact that if you don't focus on them, you could potentially be lose out on some of the big things in the world, whether it be some of the big stuff that the C-suite maybe doesn't want to think about, but probably drives a lot of the government officials crazy thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So whether it be multilateralism, whether it be the WTO, how do you guys think about that? Can you? Who's the right person to worry about some of those big things that may not necessarily rise to the top level in a company who's trying to focus on profits and people?
I'll kick us off. I'll say that, I think I start by realizing that the zone of what I can control is probably about the size of my AirPods case. That I think we often have this illusion of more control over things than we ever actually have. So I'm often kind of thinking about, what is the zone of things that I can influence? And then what are the categories of things that could most likely, again, it's the nature of the role, I tend to look to the defensive side, that could derail? What are those kind of unexpected pieces? And I think a lot of that then becomes work within the team that I have the privilege to lead around this, ideation, brainstorming, thinking about what might be possible, kind of doing some of that loose scenario testing internally within our team based on our knowledge and our relationships cross-functionally, benchmark externally, and then sort of picking from that what might be the things that we then want to highlight. We have an opportunity to gather on a quarterly basis with some of the key P&Ls across the company, and we bring in other cross-functional business partners to those. And that's really a scenario of saying, hey, here's what we're looking ahead at over the next 6 to 9 month horizon. What are we missing? Or what conversation do these things that we're watching prompt for you? And I think I found that to be a really effective way of helping keep the team and our capabilities front of mind, and also keep us tied in and relevant to the business.
Cheryl, I think that's a great point, maybe to conclude on, because I know one of the things we talked about, and Michelle, I know you've spoken about it, is kind of the world is so stressful. How do we also focus on wellness and helping people keep a balance in their life and not become so worried about all of these things that it knocks them out of whack? And so it seems to me that we've gotten some really practical suggestions on how to get your hands around some of these risks, how to plan for them, and with that, to maybe bring yourself some peace, or at least peace of mind, that you have thought through some of these really complex issues, and that if something were to happen, you would have some of the answers. So, or at least you would have a direction of travel maybe on how you would go if it hit. So with that, thank you all. What a great panel. I really appreciate everyone's comments. And Ken, I kick it back over to you.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have asked for more or better from this panel. It was fantastic. I didn't know, I knew Penny very well. I've known her a long time, but didn't know any of you all before this. And I can't wait to have you back on again in the future for other discussions. Really so clear and informative and helpful. And I hope our audience got as much out of it as I know I did. So thank you very much for joining us today. Cheryl, Michelle, Stefanie, Penny, and Marc out in the ether. Thank you for joining us. Really, really grateful to all of you. As we get ready to welcome on our